Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast, where we cover over 500 years of Lutheran history. We get to look at news stories, examine old heroes of faith, and dig into the process of making history. So whether you're Lutheran seeking to understand your faith's rich roots or someone just interested in the history of this period, you'll find what you're looking for right here. In this episode, we welcome back our returning guest, the Reverend Nathaniel Biebert, to continue his popular mini-series on the lesser-known details of the 500th anniversaries of the Reformation. So far, we've looked at the Diet of Worms and Luther's stay in the Wartburg, and we're going to continue with Luther in the Wartburg today, but looking at a project that left the Wartburg with him, I guess you might say. We'll focus on the 500th anniversary of the so-called September and then December Testaments, his translation of the New Testament into the German language, starting with the original language of the Bible of the New Testament, the Greek language. So in this case, you note, Pastor Biebert, in your paper that pretty much any detail of this event will be a detail less often told. I think many Lutherans are very familiar with the 95 Theses, the Diet of Worms, and the Wartburg. And they know that Luther translated the Bible, and maybe they know that it had an impact on the German language. That pops up a lot. But other than that, anything you have to share with us today is a lot of it was new to me as I read it, and it will be new to our listeners. So first, just to kind of get us focused on and connected with the context, can you give us a brief overview of that context of where Luther was and what he had been doing before he started his translation project?
Yeah. So first of all, great to be back on the podcast. Thanks for having me again. So Luther was at the Wartburg from 1521, May of 1521 to March 1st of 1522. Actually, I guess if you want to talk about kind of the context as far as him translating the New Testament, it maybe starts a week after he arrived at the Wartburg, when he got a belated packet forwarded to him in the mail. It was a letter from a man named Nicholas Goebel, who was a prominent humanist of the time. The humanist movement was a movement that its motto was ad fontes, or back to the sources. It was a movement very much about going back and looking at some of history's great writers and their works in the original languages, rather than kind of just trusting what medieval scholastics had written. And so he got this packet from this notable humanist who had actually mailed it to him while he was still at Worms, and it hadn't arrived in his hands while he was at Worms. And it was a letter, and it was also a Greek New Testament that this man had published on the basis largely of Erasmus's second edition of his Greek and Latin New Testament. Goebel always wanted just a Greek New Testament, just pure Greek. And the two editions that Erasmus had published were both parallel columns with Greek and Latin. And so he finally got permission from Erasmus, to publish a completely Greek New Testament. He published it in early 1521, mailed Luther a copy as a gift. He called it a bride that Luther could have with him, since obviously monks didn't marry, and Luther was still a practicing monk, if not an actual monk, since he had been formally released from his vows. So this was meant to be a bride that he could spend time with. So he was writing a lot of works in the Wartburg, working on things to keep himself busy, including a lot of German works for fellow Germans. And he was using that Greek New Testament to write some of these works against various things, like against monastic vows and things like that. And then he, at the beginning of December, he took a secret trip back to Wittenberg because he had heard that there was some unrest that was arising through people like Melanchthon and things like that. He himself doesn't seem to have grasped just how serious and how escalating the situation was. He seems to have been pretty impressed with what he found in Wittenberg, at least at that time. But it gave him a chance, this secret trip back to Wittenberg, to talk with friends and to collaborate with them about projects that he could continue on in the future. And it seems like especially Melanchthon, but there were others as well, encouraged him while he was back in Wittenberg to undertake to translate the New Testament when he returned toward the middle of December to the Wartburg. And so that was kind of the circumstances that got the project going.
All right. So that's interesting. You called it, he did, and then you talked about that his bride, that that translation. So really, that was his companion, right? That's what he spent his time with. Was, well, he already read the Bible, of course, but now he got to look at it in Greek, which is kind of mind blowing that the Reformation had been going on for 4 or 5 years, if you want to date it from the 95 Theses, and just now he gets to look at it in the Greek New Testament. Is that a fair way to put it? Or do you think he had the previous?
Luther most likely had familiarity because he had been lecturing on books of the New Testament before his whole trial and diet of being summoned to the Diet of Worms. Had been lecturing for a number of years. So I would be extremely surprised. It's pretty clear from later on that after he finished his rough draft and returned from the Wartburg to Wittenberg again for good, that he and Melanchthon and other companions consulted also Erasmus's second edition. But Luther probably had familiar with both of Erasmus's editions of the Greek New Testament from before that. I would be very surprised if he had no interaction with them from his time lecturing on various New Testament books like Romans and Galatians and Hebrews during his time at the University of Wittenberg. But he certainly had a lot more time on his hands to do that now, and he had this nice gift. Presumably Luther didn't have a copy of Erasmus's Greek New Testament with him at the Wartburg until he got Nicholas Goebbels' copy. So this was kind of his one reference to the original, the New Testament in its original language.
Okay, so that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, that you brought up those other editions. But yeah, I guess Luther probably didn't pack his entire library with him on the way to Worms, and then as he was so-called kidnapped, probably didn't take too much with him either, right? I think we even talked about what he had with him. So yeah, very interesting. So it was the gift that provided maybe the inspiration. The occasion was there with the timing and just thinking about the German people and their need for the Bible. So he had the opportunity and the prompt, I guess. So yeah,
he mentions in one of his letters to Goebbels how he considers himself to be born to serve the German people. So that, we can kind of see one of the main seeds there for what's going to end up resulting in his translation of the New Testament. There was another thought I had that just escaped my mind. From our last episode, talking about his being plagued by demons and things like that, and whether both literal and metaphorical, just not enjoying his isolation. Certainly that was extra encouragement for Melanchthon and his friends and whatever to encourage him. Here's a project not only that will keep you busy, but you'll have direct contact with the Holy Spirit, which will help arm you against some of the things that you're struggling with at the Wartburg.
Yeah. So all things considered, it was the perfect opportunity for him to undertake this project. And it seems like he really focused on it. How long did it take Luther to translate the entire New Testament from Greek into German?
Yeah, so we don't know exactly when he started. It seems that he started sometime between December 12th, when he got back. We have his first letter to a friend from back at the Wartburg on December 12th. And then on December 18th, he writes 2 different letters that day, one in which he says he's going to work on translating the Bible, and one in which he says he's currently working on it. So when he says in the earlier one that he's going to work on it, it seems like that's a reference to it being completed and not a reference to getting started on it. It appears he already had started on it by that time. So sometime between December 12th and December 18th, 1521. And then we know from letters that he wrote after he returned to Wittenberg for good in March of the following year, 1522, that he says, I translated the entire New Testament on my Patmos, and Patmos was his nickname for the Wartburg Castle, in reference to the island of Patmos where the Apostle John was isolated when he wrote the book of Revelation. So if you do the math then and calculate that, it was either about right at or a little bit less than 11 weeks for Luther to complete his entire rough draft translation of the New Testament, which is kind of a humbling thing. I think you maybe encouraged me to mention this at the last recording, and I forgot to mention it. One of the reasons that I find these anniversaries fascinating is because I myself was born in 1983, which is the 500th anniversary of Luther's birth, 1483. So whenever we hit these milestones, it's like Luther did this at my age. And so it kind of forces me to ask, what did I do in the last 11 weeks?
Right.
And definitely a heavy load of work. Obviously, he had a lot of time on his hands, but still just an impressive feat for him to translate the entire New Testament in rough draft form in about 11 weeks' time in the Wartburg Castle.
Yeah, and to be fair and honest, most Lutheran pastors, and definitely in the Wisconsin Synod and others, we emphasize the fact that all of our pastors have been trained in the Greek language, but we don't want to give the impression that any single pastor probably has the gifts or the ability, or much less the time. We can't all write our own translations of the Bible and come up with the same product quality that Luther did. So do you have any insight on where did Luther personally get the ability to do this project and do it well?
Yeah, and that's a good point that you bring up, because even for pastors who are trained in the original languages, studying the Bible in the original language is one thing. Actually producing a readable translation is a completely different thing. And so, yeah, it does prompt the question, where did Luther get the ability to do this? And I think the first answer that you have to give is just that Luther had a very good linguistic training in general. He received an excellent education in the Latin language, which even today, teachers will say, if you really want to understand really any Western language, the best place to start is to learn the Latin language. I know, even just speaking from experience, that I myself didn't really understand English and how it worked and why certain things were the way they were, rules between who and whom and things like that, until after I took Latin. And Luther received an excellent education in Latin. For instance, his schooling in Eisenach at the St. George School, he had some great teachers there. And then, of course, that excellent education was then strengthened by his monastic life when he took a vow and became a monk, where you basically only spoke Latin, at least in any formal setting, and his devotional life, which I'll talk about in just a bit as well. So yeah, he was just an excellent linguist in general. He knew how language worked. He also received an education, especially his university education, at a time when humanism was gaining ground. I already talked about humanism and humanists a little bit, but at the University of Erfurt, humanism was gaining ground. That was probably where he was first put in contact with Greek, with the Greek language, and probably had some initial studies in the Greek language there. And then also he had a good colleague to work with, at least beginning in 1518 at the University of Wittenberg. That was when Philip Melanchthon arrived. And Philip Melanchthon, even before he arrived at Wittenberg that year, had already that year at age 21. So again, what have I done with my life? At age 21, he had already published a Greek grammar that was available for sale. Melanchthon was a Greek prodigy. So whatever Greek experience and learning Luther already had was able to be encouraged that much more with his conversations with Melanchthon. As he was lecturing on various New Testament books, he could ask Melanchthon about this or that word and things like that. And then probably maybe the number one qualification is the fact that just Luther knew his Bible so well. And obviously in the Latin language, since there weren't a lot of German translations available, definitely no good German translation available. But he knew the Bible very well in the Latin language. He was given a Bible bound in red leather when he first joined the Augustinian monastery in Erfurt. And by the time he gave it back, he says in his table talk that he knew what was on every page of that Bible. You think about that Lokalgedächtnis, I think is what it's called in German. Basically, you remember where something is locally. If you wanted to know where Daniel in the lion's den was, he knew not only basically where in his Bible to look, but on what side of the page and where on the page to look for that story. And then later on, I think it was in 1532, he told his friends, another table talk, he told his friends that for some years now, I have read through the Bible twice a year, every year. So that first initial experience with that red leather Bible in the monastery was by no means his last experience. Luther was a voracious reader of the Bible. And of course, because of his sensitive conscience and his love for the gospel, he didn't just read it, he devoured it, and he took it into his mind and into his heart, and he remembered it. And so when you know the Bible, and we can attest to this as pastors too, on the weeks that we are faithful in our sermon preparation to the point where we go back to the original language to kind of glance at the Hebrew or Greek, it's easier to work through that if we already know what it says in English. And Luther had that, but with the Latin language, that he kind of already knew what it said as he was working through the Greek New Testament because of the amount of time that he had spent in the New Testament in Latin. So yeah, all of these and Luther's just good communication skills in general, which is why, for instance, like Melanchthon didn't undertake it, even though he was a Greek scholar. Melanchthon realized Luther was just a better communicator. So all of those traits together kind of combined to make Luther the perfect candidate for the job, in addition to the time he had on his hands at the Wartburg.
Yeah. So we'll get into it just a minute about the philosophy of translation. But, it seems to me like you're saying that as he translated, he already had a personal meaning of what that scripture meant to him, and he attempted to convey that through his translation. So let's see. You mentioned Melanchthon. Anyone else you want to give credit to for helping Luther on this project? It wasn't exactly, he did work alone, but he didn't just send it off to the printer after that 11 weeks either.
Yeah, so Luther completed the rough draft at the Wartburg, and that is important to know. As impressive as that feat is, and it is impressive, and we should give him all the credit he deserves for that. It's not like he came back with a polished copy to Wittenberg when he finally returned on March 1st, or headed out from the Wartburg on March 1st. There were definitely places in his manuscript that he maybe had blanks in, or tentative German translations, or maybe even just wrote the Vulgate for the time being and circled it or asterisked it or starred it in some way, knowing that he had to come back and revisit that. So that's the kind of manuscript that he returned. He actually sent off, while he was at the Wartburg, he actually mailed off the Gospels when he got done with that. And those almost got lost in the mail, which is kind of a phenomenal thing to think about what would have happened if his rough draft translation of the Gospels had been lost, because I'm sure Luther wasn't making duplicates of everything that he wrote down in his notebooks. So Melanchthon did eventually receive the Gospels notebooks with his translation, and then Luther returned with the rest of the New Testament translated as well at the beginning of March. And he set to work not only with Melanchthon, but the other key player that we're told about played a pretty key role, not just in corresponding with Luther, but also in corresponding with Melanchthon, as Luther and Melanchthon were working on this project, was Georg, or George, we would just say today, George Spalatin, who was the Elector Frederick the Wise's chaplain and private secretary. And since as a private secretary, you obviously work with words a lot, and George Spalatin himself had a good education, it seems that they consulted Spalatin as something of a wordsmith. He wasn't necessarily like a Greek scholar or anything like that. That was Melanchthon's role. But if Melanchthon told him, this is what this Greek word means, kind of in a detailed definition, he would say, okay, Spalatin, now what's the word I should use for that? And Spalatin seems to have been kind of good in that role. So it seems like that later on, when Luther finishes the entire Bible, there definitely seems to be a larger team. But as for this initial New Testament, it seems like that's kind of the main committee, is Luther, Philip Melanchthon, and George Spalatin.
All right. So now we got the trio, I guess, established. Now they had to kind of think about how they translated, right? And as you mentioned, anyone who learns a second language realizes, oh, I can't just make it mathematical, like this equals that, and I'm going to put that word in. You have to make some decisions, right? And that's called the philosophy of translation, right? What is your attitude towards the process or the goal of translation? So can you give us a summary or an overview of Luther's philosophy of translation?
Yeah, we get that not only from a later work that Luther wrote titled An Open Letter on Translating, where he talks about his New Testament and about his continued work on translating the Old Testament as well. But also there's a very interesting letter that Philip Melanchthon writes toward the end of March 1522. I think it's March 30, 1522, where Melanchthon writes this letter to Spalatin. And later in the letter, he has a list of 5 questions that he wants Spalatin already to answer for him to help them as they're kind of editing the book of Matthew, later on in the book of Matthew, going over the final drafts. And before that, though, he says, we're going to be consulting you more than just these 5 questions that I have. We're going to be consulting you to give us the proper vocables for words so that you can help us to render the New Testament Enargos and emphatikos. Those are two Greek words. And because Melanchthon's a Greek scholar, he's writing these Greek words in with his Latin letter. So yeah, he says we're looking to produce this translation in such a way that it's enargos and emphatikos, which is clearly, and you can hear the word emphatically in that second word. It's basically, we want it to be expressive, or we want it to leave an impression on the hearer. And of course, what Melanchthon is just assuming, which every translator should assume, is accuracy. That would really be the number one goal. That you want a translation that actually does say in the new language what it actually said in the old language. So that's the number one goal, is accuracy. And then Melanchthon is saying the two other goals are that we want it to be clear. In other words, it should be intelligible, understandable to the people who hear it and read it. And we want it to leave an impression. We want it to make an impact. We want it to be something that is a delight to listen to and is easily recalled and easy to commit to memory, because of the gripping way and the emphatic way and the impressionable way and expressive way that it's translated. So even still today, those are just three great goals, right? Accuracy, clarity, and then expressiveness or impactfulness, if you will. Luther, in his open letter on translating, and then also in one of his letters to Spalatin as well, kind of gives a sub-point on clarity, says that he wants this New Testament to be renowned for its simplicity. In other words, not clear. They want clarity, but they don't necessarily want clarity for scholars. They want clarity for your ordinary Joe Schmo, your ordinary layperson who's going to be listening in church. Even simple people, for the most part, should be able to understand what they're writing. So that was kind of their philosophy of translation, if you will. And even if that meant paraphrasing, I mean, nowadays, especially maybe in our circles, we kind of use translations like the Living Bible or the Message Bible as kind of a byword, or, the butt of jokes and things like that. Luther was not afraid to take a Living Bible or a Message Bible type of approach, if we want to put that in modern terms. The difference would be that oftentimes the Living Bible or the Message Bible does actually take liberties with the actual content of what the original, Greek or Hebrew is saying. Luther didn't take those kind of meaning liberties, but he was more than willing to take wording liberties and completely paraphrase something if it meant that it was going to accurately, clearly, and impactfully or expressively communicate in German what it said in Greek. So that kind of sums up their philosophy of translation, his and the team's.
Yeah, it is a team effort at this point, right? So We're talking about Luther. Other people are involved, those other guys. Melanchthon and Spalatin. So can you talk a little bit about maybe some specific challenges Luther faced now that we know what his philosophy of translation was? Did he have a challenge applying it? How did he find a balance between all those things of being clear but accurate?
Right. Yeah. So, maybe a few examples. Luther himself gave some examples, like as far as examples of where he was pretty free with his paraphrasing. One example he gives is where in the literal Greek it says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Jesus is talking. He says, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And Luther says, what German says that? No one talks about the abundance of the heart in German. So what Luther translated in that case was, what the heart is filled with, the mouth overflows with. So kind of a nice equal clause paraphrase of the original Greek there. There were other cases, though, where Luther said, I didn't just automatically abandon the original wording in every single case. He said if there was a case where it seemed like it might be important to retain the original wording for whatever reason, he said then sometimes I kept it. And he used an example from the Gospel of John where Jesus says that it is him talking about the Son of Man whom God the Father has sealed. And Luther said, I would have preferred to translate it into the German word for signified, but it seemed like the word sealed there was kind of important. So I kept the word sealed in that passage in John. And then there were some that were maybe somewhere in between. Luther himself talked about the angel's greeting to Mary in Luke chapter 1, where he says the traditional translation was Hail Mary, full of grace, which is still a traditional Roman Catholic prayer. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. And Luther said, not only does that not communicate in German, because, how are you full of grace? It could actually give a wrong impression, which of course was an impression that many Roman Catholics had, that you could go to Mary and she could pour out her grace on you, grace from on high. So Luther thought that what really the angel was saying was basically a super formal greeting, like be extended greetings, or greetings are extended to you, gracious or charming lady. But what he ended up, that is what he ended up going with. But he thought that maybe it could have even been translated as more of an informal greeting, like God greet you, dear Mary, or something like that, which was a common German greeting, to say God greet you to someone. And Luther said that's basically what the angel is saying, but he went with a more formal translation, which was basically something like greetings be extended to you, charming or gracious lady. In that case, and this is just my opinion, I think Luther himself maybe missed, in the original Greek there, the idea is that Mary is favored. She is full of grace in that sense, that she's being favored. And Luther does kind of miss that with his translation of the greeting. But from his perspective, that's where he kind of takes a middle of the road approach. He thinks that maybe he could have translated super informally, God greet you, dear Mary. But instead he kind of goes with more of a formal greeting, but he does avoid that Hail Mary, full of grace idea because of how it could convey a wrong impression and isn't really accurate in German anyway.
Yeah, the context of his own times and his own personal experience with that impression that could be given in a certain way certainly seems to have affected his translation there. I think the other one is the faith alone, kind of the famous thing where he adds the word alone to that too. Because he says, well, look at the passages just before that where that's clearly stated. So I'm just going to make it super clear here in this one passage, right?
And Luther points out, and this is still true in English too, he points out, in German, we do this all the time where, you say the farmer brings only wheat and, no corn or something like that. Like when you exclude something, then it's only the other thing. So even though the word only isn't there in Romans chapter 3, where he says, Luther translates, for we maintain that a man is justified by faith alone, apart from observing the law. Well, the fact is Paul is excluding observing of the law. So it is faith alone, even if Paul doesn't use the wording. So Luther defends that addition of the word alone at length in his open letter on translating, and does a masterful job doing so. That's another example where he adds a word that's not in the Greek language, but it's in the sense of the Greek, and Luther isn't afraid to add it if he's not adding to the meaning of the words, even if it is adding to the form of the words, if you will.
Yeah. And we could spend, and you did go into it a bit more, we could spend a lot of time just talking about this kind of stuff. I'll take a little second here to do an internal advertisement. Our episode 37 on Reforming Mary covered the same thing you talked about, the kind of the Hail Mary or what was going on there, right? So if you want to get another discussion, which was excellent on that translation decision of Luther and how he applied that to other areas of Mariology, I guess is the word for it, go to that episode and you'll have a well-rounded perspective on that topic. All right. I think we got into a lot of his practical application of that philosophy. Did you have anything else to say about maybe some technical issues that he had with translating particular words? I think we got into that a little bit. But...
so a couple of technical pursuits that Luther and his team had to chase down in the process of translating the New Testament, at least two that we're aware of, is first of all, Luther asks Spalatin on repeated occasions for the gemstones that are mentioned in Revelation chapter 21. He doesn't just want to trust other translations or trust other commentators on that. He wants to see what these gemstones are, and he wants to know what they're called in German. So he figures Spalatin, being a employee of the court, might be able to actually obtain those gemstones, and apparently he was able to obtain at least some of them. the fact that Luther doesn't describe them in the margin. Luther has a lot of marginal notes in his printed marginal notes in his New Testament. He does not have any printed marginal notes describing what these gemstones are like. For all of the interest that he shows in contacting Spalatin in the process of translating them, doesn't have any marginal notes on them. So that makes me think that maybe Spalatin wasn't able to provide all of the gemstones to him, so he wasn't just going to include descriptions of some of them if he didn't know how to describe all of them. But Spalatin was able to provide some of them to him. And then the other big technical question, which every translator still wrestles with today, it's amazing all these questions that Melanchthon asked Spalatin and that Luther asked Spalatin and ask others, how these are still questions that most translators will wrestle with today if they're translating the Bible. And that's monetary values, right? You have things in the New Testament like the assarion and the stater and the drachma and the denarius. And what are these in modern day equivalents? And so Melanchthon did a lot of footwork for Luther on that. He contacted not only Spalatin, but contacted another renowned humanist and a physician in Erfurt by the name of George Sturz, asking for input on this. We don't know what kind of replies he got or feedback that he got, but we can tell from those letters that Melanchthon had already done a lot of research himself, trying to come up with these values. And then whatever answers he got back, Luther then took all that information and came up with, in keeping with his translation philosophy, very simple solutions. Trying to think of examples of that without having the paper in front of me. I remember
I wrote down one of them because
the supposed widow's mite. She's got two lepta, which make up, and I forget what the name of the coin is in the Greek New Testament, where it's two lepta, which weren't even official coins, but these two super small coins made up the smallest official Roman coin. So Luther kind of took that and made somewhat of an equivalent, and said two little scherfs, which make a heller. And scherfs were the smallest official German coins. And the heller was kind of your standard small German coin, maybe something like a nickel or a dime today. And then scherfs would be like a penny, something equivalent of a penny. So he says, yeah, the lady put in, the widow put in two little scherfs, which make a heller. And other than that, throughout came up with very simple solutions, not extremely complex equivalents, but, a half gulden for this, or another coin for that. And he tried to keep them very simple as far as how to translate them.
Yeah, and I think maybe the notable thing from both those examples with the jewels and the money is quite obviously those particular individual words aren't really going to do much affecting any doctrine at all.
Right.
They're only used to illustrate something or maybe even just to record a historical fact. And you get an impression for either the relative greatness of the amount of money or the relative smallness of it. Yeah. So there's meaning behind it as far as it's the value associated in the hearer. But the fact that going into such detail, trying to understand these little things that maybe seem a little, I think just illustrates how faithful these translators were to the accuracy and the respect that they had for the word of God, that they wanted to get it as right and as good as possible. Where, if you're rushed for time, you say, let's just get this over with. Maybe that's where that makes a difference between an excellent translation and a good translation. And this is kind of where Luther stands out.
Yeah. And Melanchthon makes some of those comments, basically to what you just said, but the difference between an excellent translation and a good translation, makes some comments in some of those letters where he's trying to find these monetary values, saying, I think he exclaims to Spalatin, look at the unfaithfulness of the translators who didn't even, try to find out what these were really valued at. And then to George Sturz, he said something like, translators blame the fact that they can't come up with monetary equivalents on the difficulty of the content, but I blame it on them. Like they didn't try hard enough. You have to put in this work if you're going to translate the Bible, is basically what Melanchthon is saying. And so, they put in the groundwork. And then when you read Luther's translation, it just reads so simply. He picks these simple monetary values, but he was able to pick those with confidence after knowing, kind of more exact and detailed information. And that's the huge work behind the scenes, that it's the translator's greatest pride if no one notices that it was there, right? That they just read it and they understand it, and it reads smoothly, and they don't even know that all the work was done. And that's how Luther wanted it to be.
Yeah. And that being said, it's an issue of language. Like, this whole thing is about language. And one of the courses I'm taking right now is on the interpretations of Luther and the Reformation. And it's out there, so we need to look at it. It's the Marxist interpretations of Luther. And, what was the East German government, the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, DDR, GDR, they wanted to celebrate. They only got the 500th anniversary of Luther's birth before their regime collapsed. But what do we do with Luther? Does it prop up the state? Can we get some tourist money off it? And the communists, they used to hate Luther. Then they said, well, we could still profit from him, so we'll spin him our way. And one of the few things that they were able to do without getting too religious was they said, well, he's still important because of his impact on public education, how he affected music. And one of the things, though, where they even said that Luther is a heritage for us, even as an atheistic government, was his impact on the German language. So even outside of the religious realm, the religious sphere of history, Luther's recognized for his work on language, and particularly it's this translation of the Bible. So we could spend, and others have spent, so much time just talking about the language issue, but could you briefly comment on the impact of Luther's translation on the German language itself, if that were possible?
Yeah, so there's kind of three early editions of the New Testament. The ones that are most well known are the September and the December Testament, which were both published in Wittenberg. But then there was also, in the days before copyright laws, strict copyright laws, an edition by Adam Petrie of Basel, who basically took Luther's September Testament and republished it under his own publishing house. All three of those editions sold out in a matter of months. And it was like 3,000 copies per edition. So 9,000 copies sold in the first 4 months, I believe it was, from the time that his first September New Testament was published. September 25-ish was when it was fully for sale, 1522. From that date, it was about 4 months and 9,000 copies sold. Now you can say, well, a lot of it was probably rich people, and there probably was a number of rich people that purchased it, but there weren't 9,000 noblemen that were purchasing these copies. People were saving up if they needed to, and buying, and it was a considerable expense. We're told that they sold, depending on if you got it, bound with a cover or just, sort of loose leaf, whether you got special historiated initials with it or whatever. It could be anywhere from a half gulden to 1.5 gulden. Well, a gulden in 1542 anyway could buy a whole pig. So this is not a cheap amount, even if we're talking about a half gulden. So ordinary common people had to save up, but it was worth saving it up for them. Now they could read the Bible in their own language. And that's the same experience that Bible translators have today when they translate the Bible into a new language. Is people tend to eat it up like, wow, I can actually read this famous book now, and I can read it and understand it in my own language. And they're willing to put some money behind it or put some effort into obtaining it. And the German people were too. And when you have that many people reading the same literature, it's going to have a uniting effect. And the other thing maybe to mention there is that just because of Luther's location being in electoral Saxony, that kind of was where a number of dialects merged. And Luther himself noted that at his table one time. He said, I don't speak a particular German dialect, but I speak a general one because my speech imitates the Saxon chancellery. And I think it was Martin Brecht who made the comment that something like 80 to 90% of Luther's vocabulary could be understood by people in both northern and southern Germany, or upper and lower Germany. And so that obviously had a tremendous impact as well. That here's a book which, even if I don't speak exactly like how this is printed, I can still read it and understand it if I'm from over here, or if I'm from way over here where they speak a different dialect of German. Kind of like how today, you have different dialects in Alabama, different dialects of English in, rural Wisconsin or rural Alabama, and then out on the East Coast and out on the West Coast. But the news anchors are able to speak in such a way that everyone can understand them. That's kind of what Luther was for the nation of Germany.
Yeah, I think that's a good illustration of how that works in modern times. So let's see. You note that we can learn a lot about how Luther viewed the books of the New Testament themselves by the prefaces he wrote for them. So not only did he translate the Bible, then he said, well, let me help you understand the Bible. So what were some of his comments that stood out to you that kind of indicated his view of Scripture?
Yeah, so he loved the Gospel of John, and he loved Paul's letters, and he loved the first letter of Peter. And those are the books that he recommended heartily in his prefaces to his readers, because there you didn't just have stories that you kind of then had to interpret yourself, or visions that you had to have someone interpret for you, or whatever. You had straightforward, clear language, proclaiming Christ, proclaiming his work, proclaiming what his life and death means for us, and telling us how we're saved through faith in him. And so that was definitely the kind of literature that Luther produced, that Luther preferred. He kind of liked those books where, you could put it this way, he liked those books of the New Testament where if you had only them, like not even just the New Testament without the Old Testament, but if you had only Romans, or if you had only First Peter, and you read that, you would know what the Christian faith was about, and you could believe it, and you could be saved. That's probably the simplest way to sum up how Luther rated the books of the New Testament. He also observed the fact that some of them, it wasn't just a matter of clarity, but also a matter of how he was honoring church history and saying, hey, there was a time in early church history when some of these books were disputed even by honest scholarly Christians. And we should at least be acknowledging that. How they didn't always stand on the same footing from early on. There were some books that were just undisputed the whole time, the letters of Paul, for instance, and there were others that were more disputed. So he was also honoring the history and the tradition of the church as well, and how these books of the Bible came down to us. But yeah, that was his main thing, was just, does this book clearly proclaim Christ, so that I could read this book, know what the Christian faith is about, believe in Jesus as my savior, and be saved. And that was kind of how he rated the books.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it explains why maybe the one other thing that people really know about this translation, or Luther's view in the Bible at least, is he infamously, I guess you could say, called the book of James an epistle of straw, right?
Right.
Which, taken out of context, sounds like he was totally rejecting or even mocking a book of the Bible. Right. But that's what he's saying. The point that you were making was what he was trying to say by that. And of course, there's a whole lot more he said about James, which is positive as well. But yeah, just this idea that you're not going to find the essentials, the core doctrines of truth, of theology expressed.
James is really hammering home the fruits of faith. He's not hammering home the faith itself.
Right.
So.
Yeah, so it's still useful. It's a supplement, though, maybe in his view, to the other books of the Bible, where read this second, right? Don't go here primarily for what we're focusing on. Yeah. All right. So how did Luther intend the Bible to be pleasant sounding to the ear? So not only understandable and clear and accurate, but he wanted people to like it, I guess, is another way to put it.
Yeah, and that's part of the emphaticos, right? Wanting it to be memorable and a pleasure to listen to. And yeah, that's really, I would say that is a unique hallmark of Luther's translation of the New Testament that perhaps isn't really valued or emphasized enough. That it really is. The last few months, I haven't been reading just a ton in Luther's Bible or in Luther's New Testament, but with this project kind of in mind, I would look up, if I was preaching on this text or this text, look up how Luther translated it and read it out loud just to see how it sounded. And there are just a large number of passages where it's clear that Luther just had a knack for literary tools like assonance and consonance and alliteration, but then just rhythm and pace. There are some passages like 1 Timothy in English. This is a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst, and so on. If you read that in German, it is just the most beautifully paced and rhythmic German that you could have. And Luther just nailed it, not only in capturing it accurately, but also in pacing it in such a way where it's just a pleasure to listen to. And I would imagine a pleasure to speak as well from the lectern or from the pulpit. And that makes it that much easier to memorize, that much easier to take back with you in your mind and in your heart. And Luther really had a knack for doing that. Knock and the door will be open to you was klopft an, so wird euch aufgetan. It even rhymed. In some cases, even though it wasn't poetry, Luther would find ways to make it rhyme if he could. Another example that sticks out in my mind is Luther's translation of "Let your light shine before people." Also, lasst euer Licht leuchten vor den Leuten. You can hear all the repetition of vowel sounds and the repetition of the L sound, the alliteration there. So whenever he could, he used an opportunity, and that's where Luther would definitely be the chief guy responsible for that. That wasn't Melanchthon's gift. That was Luther's gift, that he knew how to communicate in a gripping way in the German language.
Yeah, and that just has sparked a thought for me right now. And you've studied Lutheran music more profoundly than I have, but people like Michael Praetorius or J.S. Bach would take Luther's translation and set it to music, and it already has the flow and the tone, and even you get bonus points, I guess, when it rhymes, right? And it just sounds good. It sounds almost musical before it's even set to music, and they just took that and ran with it, which is why it's maybe it sounds biased, but really Lutheran religious music is some of the most beautiful sounding stuff, even to this day, that you can hear, just because of the language, how it sounds.
That's where you can say that you're not biased, as if it's timeless. I mean, it's 500, 400, 300 years old, and people are still flocking in to listen to it and to hear it because of that. Another example, you saying that reminded me, another example I gave in my paper was when when Luther translates, when the Jewish leaders are grumbling that Jesus welcomes sinners. Dieser nimmt die Sünder an, is how Luther translates it. And Erdmann Neumeister just substitutes Jesus for dieser and turns it into a hymn. Yeah. Jesus nimmt die Sünder an, which we know as Jesus sinners does receive. And it's a great hymn in English too. But the difference is there's no translation in English that says this man sinners does receive. That would sound weird if that was in an English translation, but Neumeister was able to just lift that straight from the Bible and just substitute Jesus for dieser, this man. And it was a perfectly acceptable opening phrase for a hymn.
Yeah. And I encourage you, if you are at all bilingual between English and German, just look up, a lot of our hymnals, they have like the tune name is actually the German name of it. It's pretty easy to Google it or go on Spotify or wherever and find it. Just have your hymnal open compared to maybe like the German passages or whatever. And it just it just fits better sometimes, where it clicks, the punchiness of the words, if that makes sense, or it just hits the emphasis differently in the original language. So that's a whole nother topic. But I think, Luther was a musical man as well. And I don't know if he was consciously saying, I want this to be singable. Maybe he was, I don't know. But I think that probably all played into the pleasantness of the words too. All right, well, that was a fun tangent. I wasn't expecting to go on, but let's get to our final questions here today. So how was his so-called September Testament received? So this is September of 1522. It's published, it's printed. You noted, and we maybe don't have time for it now, but just how he used Lucas Cranach and the other artists to illustrate the Bible, to make it even visually appealing, not only to the sense of hearing it, but now with the sense of sight. But how was it received in general? Yeah,
so it was received well. I did mention earlier, the 3,000 copies of the first edition sold out relatively quickly. The printers made good business off of it. Luther himself intentionally didn't receive so much as a heller for it. And I even read somewhere, I had difficulty looking up to see if there were any primary sources where I could find this, but at least one author claimed that not only did he not receive any recompense for it, which was fine. He didn't want any recompense for it, but he, in Luther's mind, didn't even receive enough free copies. And I couldn't find anything in the primary sources to verify that, but that would be kind of an interesting note, because usually, as an author of a book, you usually do get a number of free copies that you can hand out to friends. And you would think that with such a big project that made so much money for the printers, that Luther would have gotten a number of free copies to hand out to people. Maybe one other thing just to note as far as how it was received is there were critics of it, for sure. Luther mentions that in his open letter on translating. A lot of people, especially in the Catholic Church, didn't like his addition of the word alone in Romans 3, verse 28. Luther pointed out a great proverb. He said, "He who builds along the road has many masters." You know, if you do a work that's visible to the public eye, you're going to have a lot of critics. You need, that comes with the territory, and you need to be ready for it. And so, yeah, he had a lot of critics. But what's kind of interesting is that even some of his critics, like one of his most vociferous critics, then eventually took Luther's New Testament, took out all of Luther's prefaces and his marginal notes and stuff like that, or at least the lion's share of them, and then basically published it with his own prefaces and his own marginal notes, but the translation itself was almost word for word Luther's. So even in criticizing Luther and trying to get people away from Luther's translation, by publishing his translation almost word for word in imitation of Luther's, he was actually commenting on just how high quality Luther's translation actually was. Also, Duke George of Saxony, who was a very vociferous opponent of Luther and the Reformation movement, he was not happy with the papal tiara that made its way onto 3 of the characters in the Revelation woodcuts. And due to his complaints and the complaints of others, I think Elector Frederick of Wise kind of used some of his strong arm tactics to say, when you come out with the second edition of this in December, these need to be changed. And so those papal tiaras were exchanged for simple crowns in the December Testament. And a close observer of the woodcuts in Revelation will notice that there's a difference in the crowns on the beast and on the whore of Babylon between the September Testament and the December Testaments. But in classic Luther fashion, when the whole Bible got translated and then produced with even more woodcuts, those papal tiaras were restored. And by that time, the Lutheran Reformation had enough momentum where no one was going to stop him and Cranach and his woodcuts from doing that. So,
yeah, that's an interesting anecdote. And just, yeah, the visual presentation is still important, right? And I think Luther really got that, not just with his Bible, but with pretty much everything. Yeah, the first impression matters.
Right.
All right. Well, I think we're at a good point to wrap it up for today. But finally, what is one more thing, or one thing that you think Lutherans can take away from having learned about Luther's New Testament translation today?
One thing,
or more. You can go. You can 2 or 3 if you want.
Certainly, when you study. Really, I would think this would have to be the case if you study the process of any Bible translation, whether it's just a portion of the Bible or in the entire Bible. It kind of stresses for you not to take God's word for granted. Pastors will lament, especially in our day and age, about the growing biblical illiteracy. That's not a good sign, because biblical illiteracy means we are taking God's word for granted and we're not spending the time in it that we should, in spite of the fact that in English we have multiple good translations to choose from in many cases. So yeah, when you kind of get a peek behind the curtain and see just how much work goes into this, and then just stop to think about the fact that, wow, God has cloaked his wisdom, his eternal plan, his eternal thoughts, and his eternal doctrine has found a way to cloak these things in human language, and then to give gifts to people so that not is it just in any human language, but it's in my language, and I can go and I can read it and I can access it and I can be put in touch with the thoughts of God's heart and mind. How can we leave our Bibles sitting there on the shelf and not read them and not make use of them? And then maybe if I could just add one more thing, still today, translators will go back to Luther because his philosophy of translation was so eminently sound. Even if they might disagree with how he put his philosophy into practice here or there, they can't argue with the philosophy itself. And so that's why Luther continues to be studied today and almost needs to be studied today by Bible translators. And he kind of inspires them too. I mean, do we not have that kind of rhythm and pace and assonance and alliteration and whatnot in our English translations because English doesn't lend itself to that? Or is it because we haven't tried hard enough? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that question is, but Luther's translation at least gives us something to strive for in that regard and say, can we do better? Can we make this even better than what it already is? So yeah, tremendous value for us giving praise to God and thanking him for putting his word in our language. And then also thanking him for the particular gifts that he gave to Martin Luther, which continue to have an impact and continue to be necessarily studied today.
All right. Yeah, all good points. And I agree with your assessment there. So that's the end of our time today. Thank you again, Nathan, Pastor Biebert, for joining us. Lost track of how many times it's been. I'm guessing it's at least the fourth, if not the fifth time, and always a pleasure to have you with us today. For our listeners, please check out our Facebook page or our Patreon page, and you can find us elsewhere as well to stay in contact with us and give your feedback or see the other things we have available from the Lutheran History Podcast. All right. Thank you for joining us again.
My pleasure.